Good morning, friends. Welcome to Underground Seminary. Took me a second to figure out where we're at. Keller United Methodist Church. If you are online watching this live, of course, Pastor Dan is here to field any comments, questions, concerns. And then Sean's working audio in the back, so if there's any sound issues, just make comments there, and Dan will pass that along. If you're here in the house, welcome. Good to see you all. Thanks for braving the foggy weather. And here we are, week 3-ish, and we've only lost a couple. So far we're holding good on attrition. We'll start with chapter 2 today. As I mentioned in the beginning of all this, we'll move through this pretty slowly, and it's not to be patronizing or laborious or to treat you as though you are a complete moron. It's to help all of us, myself included, move through at a pace so that we can take seriously and wholeheartedly kind of their overall philosophy, theology, and thought. If you agree with it or not, but that's not really kind of the game. The point first is just to understand it, right? Just to kind of grasp it. And then, I'm sure, because you are a smart human being, you will immediately start to grapple with if I agree with it, if I like it, if I don't. And so my emphasis is trying to just get us to move towards understanding before we get to evaluation. So that's why I choose to move in this way relatively slowly. Plus, I talk a lot. So there's that also. Okay, chapter 2, page 20 is where we'll start. I don't know how far we'll get, but we should at least get to Dorotheos of Gaza and the introductory concept of the wheel. That will be a thing that she'll return to a bit. And in fact, here at Keller Church, here in about a month, we'll actually preach on some of this stuff. And so you're getting a little preview of what's to come in the sermon series that we're calling Kellerisms. So let's open with prayer and then kind of center ourselves, and we'll move along. And so, holy and gracious God, whose presence we live and move and have our being, for this gift of this day, and for the changing of the seasons, for the ways in which you remind us that you are always on the move, we are grateful. And so guide us in your movements, that we might, with clear eyes and open ears, receive what you have for us this day. And so give us the patience with ourselves and with one another. Give us gentleness as we move through our own lives. And we trust that you hold our concerns and our thoughts in the palm of your hand so that we might be open to receive your good word for us this day. For the church, for this church, for the nation, and for the state and our community, God, we lift all of this in our prayers. Amen. As you started to read through chapter 2, did anything stand out to you either in chapter 2 or in the previous conversations? Has anything bubbled up, stuck with you? Questions, comments? Yeah, Neil. Yeah, for those online, just to repeat, Neil's pointing out the impossibility of loving God without loving neighbor, or it's impossible to love neighbor without loving God, right? And that it's kind of a nice little litmus test, right? That if you think you're loving God, but it's actually resulting in hatred or resentment or judgmentalism towards neighbor, then guess what? You're not loving God. It's a nice little piece there. And if you're moving closer to neighbor and you think that you're loving your neighbor, but it's not actually drawing you into communion with the Creator, then you're not really loving your neighbor. You might be doing kindness, right, or acts of charity, but there's nothing necessarily sacrificial about that, right? There's nothing that kenotically empties yourself to move you towards the neighbor, right? So it's a nice little litmus test, right? If actions in our family or community or nation are pulling us asunder, but we're all doing it in the name of God, then I think we know that that's kind of bullcrap, right? That it's not actually doing the thing that we said it's doing, right? Or vice versa, right? Are you with me? So, yeah, the interconnectivity and the way that they're yoked together, they're inseparable. That's not just from Bondi, right? That's from Jesus, right? That's the greatest commandment, right? 1 and 1a. They are inseparable. Good. Other reflections or thoughts? Yeah, Kara. Yeah, so she's bringing up, for those online, talking about perfectionism on page 21 and following. And Kara used the word modern way of understanding perfection. Bondi, I think, uses a more accurate and helpful term for me, and that she calls it pagan. That pagan way of understanding perfection versus the desert tradition. For whatever it's worth, I find that language also to be a little provocative, right? Because it's not just Greek thought, but that it's pagan. It's actually not of this Christian tradition in the slightest. We actually call it pagan. There are some Greek things within Christianity that make a lot of sense and we all adhere to and all that stuff. So it's not just categorically Greek thought that's problematic, right? Bondi is very clever to point out, no, this way of thinking about perfectionism, yes, it might come out of Greeks and the Stoics and this like Platonic ideal, but that way isn't exclusively Greek. That way of thinking has always been the pagan way of thinking about things, right? For instance, astrology, right, is another form of this idea of perfectionism, right? Or perfection is whole and complete. That you're able to kind of discern or figure out what the right thing to do or the correct way of living or who to marry or who to have a real estate transaction with or whatever, if you just knew, oh, well, they're a Sagittarius, so that explains so much, right? And you are acting like a Sagittarius, and I wouldn't expect you to act any other way. And in fact, it would be ideal as a Sagittarius if you would live into your full Sagittarii or whatever, right? And so it's the pagan way of thinking about the world is that things can be whole and complete, lacking a lack, right? The pagan idea that something can lack a lack. Does that make sense? Are you with me? Paganism, at its core, suggests that you and I can do things, be things that do not have any lack, any deficiency, any error, any crack. That we become beings that lack a lack. Are you with me? Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes, before he dies, he writes about what he foresees in the future. Dietrich Bonhoeffer died in Nazi concentration camps back right before it was liberated. And he's not Jewish, he's a Christian guy. But he wrote about this thing called religionless Christianity. Has anybody ever heard of this phrase, religionless Christianity? So I would argue that any religion that promises you that you can lack a lack, right? That you can do all the things, or you can read the tea leaves in a certain way, or say the right prayer, or be baptized in a certain way, or go through certain rituals, or believe certain things, that you can do these things. If you do Dan and I talked about this before, if you do the incantation properly, right, then you will be able to you'll be able to remove the lack, and you'll be whole and perfect and complete. That promise that you're broken and all this stuff, and then if you follow our thing, you will be whole and complete. That is called, I would argue that Bonhoeffer would suggest that is called religion, right? Now imagine you don't talk about religion, but you just talk about it in commodities. Hey, you open up your cabinet and all your products, all your Tupperware falls out. You lack any sort of organization. You know what you need to do? You need to buy this product that will organize all of your stuff, right? And then you open up your pantries and all your stuff is organized. And look, you don't lack any disorganization. Now you're whole and complete and you're happy and your family will love you and your kids will behave and life will be well because you have this Tupperware organizer. And we all know that is bullshit, right? Right? We know that about commodities. But we refuse to see that same structure is deployed within religion, right? And when we deploy that in religion, we're promising something that Christianity does not promise, which is why Bonhoeffer suggests that what we need to move towards, he's writing in the era of Nazi Germany, right? Where the cultural zeitgeist is one of moving towards a Christian pure society, right? Using all this Christian language to, are you with me? To eliminate any lack. Gypsies, gay folk, Jews, black people, right? We're going to get rid of all of that, and then, okay? And then we'll be perfect. And then we'll be perfect. We will have the perfect German society, right? That is religion, right? And Bonhoeffer is saying Christianity needs to become a religionless religion. Are you with me? It has to be a religion that critiques that idea of religion. It has to be the counter, it has to be the protest, it has to be the good news against this bullcrap over here. Okay? And then, unfortunately, he, with 11 million other people, were killed, murdered, right? And he wasn't even Jewish. He was a good German. But he critiqued the system, right, in a way that says what we need is a Christianity that critiques this bullcrap Christianity, right? We need a religionless religion, as it were, right? Religionless Christianity. So the desert folks, I would argue, and I think Bondi does a very good job at highlighting their criticism of that same structure of perfectionism. The promise of, if you just sacrifice the right amount, or if you just saw this certain soothsayer, or you know what I mean? Then you will be someone who lacks any lack, and you will be perfect, without flaw, without fracture, without a break. But the desert folks said, cool, have you read the gospel? Right? Because if you've read the gospel, the core, the crux of the gospel is rooted in a God who dies, a God who needs, a God who has cracks and fractures, you know? That's the heart of this gospel. This is good news, right? This Christian critique of religion, of this false promise of wholeness and completeness, this is liberative. You are now free. You are liberated. You are set free from the bondage, the shackles of the frenetic pursuit of this bullcrap idea that you can be whole and complete and without a lack. Right? You can now step into just being Jeff, you know, Pam. We can be assured that who we are is who we are. And God gives grace and wonderful mercies for that. And can we as a people gather together, right? I think that's what these desert folks were trying to do. Gather together to try to expose and to see what would it look like for a social cohesive group to come together. Built not around this idea of perfection without flaw, right? But perfection in love, which is messy and complicated, right? So the pursuit of perfection and what that means is different in a pagan, or what I would suggest maybe religious way of being, versus the Christian or the religionless Christianity, right? It is so categorically different. And if there's anything that the Christian church today is kind of internally struggling and fighting against, it's that, right? This promise that religion makes that if you are a member of our church, then nothing bad will happen to you. If you say all the right prayers, I don't know how many people I've heard say, well, they've lived such a good life and somehow they got cancer. Well, yeah. It's not because, they're not being punished. Have you read the book of Job? Bad things happen. There's a crack within all of this. How do we respond? Neil. Yeah, so giving, I think if I could, the idea of giving your life to Christ and then therefore you're saved, this ideology. I want to go on the record by saying I'm a big fan of giving your life to Jesus. 100% think everybody should do this. I'm a big fan of this. I do not think that it is formulaic, that if you give your life to Jesus, you are forever good and clean and clear and perfect. Just look at the 12 disciples. They gave their lives to Jesus, and there was some disgruntlement, right? There was some falling away. There was some bad stuff that happened to some of them, right? So anytime that we're saying that following Jesus will always result in perfection, as in the elimination of any rupture, any fracture, any crack, any break, any lack, to me, that's problematic. You see it on the right, and frankly, we're starting to see it more and more on the left. Purity cultures, right? If you're not saying the exact phrase the way I need you to say this phrase, right, then you are not part of us. Right. So I'm not here to critique the left or the right. I'm here to critique that whole idea that the pursuit of kind of the ritual purity creates the condition that the promise that you can somehow transcend all of your broken and ugliness, and move beyond it. If you just, believed the right political philosophies or voted the right way or used the correct language, right? This is happening all around us, right? This pursuit of perfection, as in the pursuit of purity, complete lacking a lack. This only creates conditions where there is scapegoating and blaming, and the group gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Just think of any utopian society that's ever been made, they all implode, right? They all do. The desert folks, while they might have removed themselves from the city centers, never sought to build a utopia. None of that is in their language. None of that is in their work, right? They're never trying to escape the brokenness of society or their brokenness of selves, but rather would often say, hey, if you think that you've reached perfection in this wholeness and completeness, you know what we should pray for? Everybody gather around. Let's pray that you get a demon to come and wrestle with you, right? Because the most dangerous thing isn't to wrestle with a demon. The most dangerous thing is to think that you are beyond demon wrestling, right? Like that you're somehow transcended the power of, you know what I mean? What are you talking about, dude? Other things. Sorry, that was a kind of a diatribe there. But that's, again, I know that's kind of an excursus, but it's also kind of to point out the larger thematic pieces of these desert folks and the seedbed by which they generated what they did. We are now, I would argue, starting to see some of the fruit of that in the tradition that I know, in the Wesleyan tradition, but then even here at Keller United Methodist Church. For instance, we don't say that we're going to talk about this on Sunday. We're not a community, right? We're not a congregation. We say that we're a communion. And by definition, a communion is something that is broken, right? Just think of the communion. It's broken. It's poured out. There's a rupture. There's a fracture. Are you with me? As a communion, what does it mean to be a social group that's defined by being a communion, not a community and not a congregation, but a communion, right? Okay, we'll talk more on Sunday about that. But other thoughts, reflections as you've read up to this point or listened or shared your own thoughts. On page 20, Bondi wrote, loving is natural. It is unnatural not to love. And she goes on to say that in verse 21, chapter 20, page 21, true love as the goal and the disciplines designed to foster it were sometimes confused. Did you catch that? Right there underneath perfectionism. Confusing their means with their ends. Right? This is a common critique that Jesus had of the Pharisees. Right? They were confusing their means and their ends. Right? They thought that being perfect in love meant keeping Sabbath in a particular way. Right? And if they kept Sabbath in a particular way, then they acquired love or unity with God, perhaps. And Jesus is like, yeah, but back to Neil's point, but the way that you're keeping Sabbath is actually driving you away from loving your neighbor, and so it's not actually doing the thing that you think it's doing. You're confusing the means and the ends. You've got to jettison. You've got to change the means. And so remember, yeah, it's the Sabbath, but people are hungry. So what's more important, the means of practicing Sabbath or the ends, propagating love? What's more important? Don't confuse the two. Don't confuse the two, right? There's a nice little story. Nice, I don't know if it's nice, but it's a little story, right? Of these a saint this and Abba that. I can't ever say these people's names. Where this one says, "Come, let us see one another before we depart, before we die." And when they came, they rejoiced in each other's company during the meal. They were brought a bird. One of the saint took it and gave it to the Abba. And the old man said to him, "Forgive me, but since I've taken this practice, this habit, since I've become a monk, I haven't eaten meat since it has been killed. That has been killed." And so the bishop answered him, "Well, since I took the habit, I haven't allowed anyone to go to sleep with a complaint against me, and I have not gone to rest with a complaint against another." The old man replied, "Forgive me, your way is better than mine." Right? The one, right? The Abba confuses the means and the ends, right? The abstaining from meat that had been killed, right, is kind of a protest against any sort of violence against, others and nature, right? So, hey, I'm not going to participate in systems of violence, right? And perhaps in the pursuit of doing that, he actually also participated in violence. Self-righteous posturing. Oh, I don't eat that. Food is a real easy one to poke fun of. We all do it. We're all real puritanical about our foods. And we'll go somewhere and we're like, well, I don't eat that. I don't eat that. And you might be doing it for whatever reason you're doing for it, but whenever that's what's before you and you kind of push it away, my son, no matter how hard we try, we'll make dinner and we will work our butts off to make dinner. We did it last night. We made shrimp. I love shrimp. My wonderful, delightful child of God's son came home and said, "Ugh! This food is so mid. I don't know. It's not a compliment." And he sat down and he just kind of sulked, right? Good for him. He didn't eat shrimp because he doesn't eat shrimp, apparently, right? Fine. But in doing that, right, that created a lot of dis-ease, discomfort, and hurt feelings, right? From my son to his mother, right, who worked really hard to try to get this meal on time because we all had to wait for him to get there, because we're all trying to, are you with me? Now, my son, I love him and he's wonderful, but my son is a nice example of something that all of us will probably do by the end of the day, right, in some capacity. We'll pursue our own sense of the most loving thing I can do is X, and I'm going to confuse my means from the ends, and I'll end up doing the very harm I say I don't want to do, right? Like Paul says, I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I do want to do. Yes. Again, she highlights this notion of the pagan thought, right? That perfection is without flaw, error, or the need or the ability to change. The need or the ability to change, right? If you're perfect, you no longer perfect as in lacking any sort of lack. You no longer have a need to change, but you also no longer have the ability to change, right? So, Gregory of Nyssa, on page 23, sorry, we're skipping over just a little bit. You see there, to be a human being, the start of paragraph 2, right? To be a human being, said Gregory, one has to change, right? One has to change. He goes on to say, down there at the bottom, for this is truly perfection, never to stop growing towards what is better and never placing any limit on perfection, that we can never arrive, right? That we can never arrive. And then this arrival is some sort of cause for celebration. Rather, if we were to arrive, right, it's we've gone astray, right? Because the arrival is actually evidence that we've stopped growing / changing, and we've adopted the pagan idea of perfection, right? For this is truly perfection, never to stop growing towards what is better, and never placing any limit on perfection, which might be why we say God is limitless, right? God has got a different type of perfection, right? Perfection, in a pagan sense, is a closed system, right? Because if it doesn't have a boundary, it means it can always move or ebb or flow or change, right? Perfection in a pagan sense is always it's always bound. There's limits, right, that are imposed upon it. Because any deviation from that then creates the opportunity for evolution or change or development, right? Because it can keep, moving out. Our universe continues to expand, right? It's limitless. If it were ever contained, then we could kind of study it as a closed system, right? But it continues to, for whatever reason, push outward, right? The next bit that she's going to talk and revisit Dorotheus's. This is kind of the crux, not the crux, but one of the returning metaphors that she utilizes. The Dorotheus of Gazo, the wheel. Dorotheus, clever little guy. He wrote a series of sermons and lectures that were geared specifically not to the masses, but to his group of men that he lived with, who were all, in the name of God, beloved jerks. They were all just like angry, bickering, 20-something-year-old guys. Have you ever met a 20-something-year-old guy? Great. Well, he lived amongst those people, right? And so most of his sermons and lectures and teachings are around addressing anger, addressing sexual lust, and addressing this notion of love, because that's his context. And so he comes up with this idea that Dorotheus regularly kind of echoes back throughout his other teachings, like the wheel, or like the circle. And so I'll just read this so that we're all operating on the same page 25. Dorotheus writes this metaphor: suppose we were to take a compass and insert a point and draw the outline of a circle. The center point is the same distance from any point on the circumference. Now, let us suppose that this circle is the world, that God himself is the center. The straight lines drawn from the circumference to the center are the lives of human beings. Let us assume, for the sake of the analogy, that to move toward God, then, human beings move from the circumference along the various radii to the center of the circle. But at the same time, the closer they are to God, the closer they become to one another. The closer they are to one another, the closer they become to God. He goes on to say in the very next paragraph in this writing, now consider in the same context the question of separation. For when they stand away from God and turn to external things, it is clear the more they recede and become distant from God, the more they become distant from one another. See? He writes, this is the very nature of love. The more we are turned away from God and neighbor, that's funny. The more we are turned away from God and neighbor and do not love God, the greater the distance that separates us from our neighbor. If we were to love God more, we should be closer to God, and through love of him, we should be more united in love of our neighbor. And the more we are united to our neighbor, the more we are united to God. May God make us worthy to listen to what is fitting for us and do it. For in the measure that we pay attention and take care to carry out what we hear, God will always enlighten us and make us understand God's will. Nice. So that's the extended quote that Bondi pulls from there, right? This notion of together and separate, inward, outward, the notion of and the interconnectivity of love of God, love of neighbor, and then she starts getting into kind of love of self, right? And how all of those interplay. So any reflections on that metaphor of the Dorotheos' wheel? It's a very simple metaphor. I know that that's pretty basic. Again, in 3 or 4 weeks, this wheel notion will be one of the sermons, and we'll talk about I think I'm going to bring the little bicycle in, and I want to show you guys some stuff that I've experienced over the past 2 months while riding a bicycle that has spokes and wheels and hubs, and what this kind of looks like and what it sounds like. What does it look like for a wheel to not have an outer rim? What does it look like for a wheel to not have a center hub? And how does all of that impact and inform a communion such as Keller, right? So it's not just while it is a simple metaphor, right? A wheel, spokes, and got it. Spend time with this metaphor, and it will become richer over your reflection. It not just informs your actions and behaviors, but it gives you a different sort of ideal that drives and informs how we actually have to use Bonhoeffer's line, life together, right? How do we do our experience? How are we doing this thing? Does that make sense? Hopefully in time it will. She also highlights the connection between this political aspect, right? She talks about, I'm only human. If we deploy this idea like, hey, I'm only human, I can't love the way God loves, I'm only human, we kind of slide into nihilism, and that's incredibly problematic. It also, this I'm only human, the desert tradition might suggest that phrase, I'm only human, is not of God, right? That's actually a nice little demon that's reminding you that you're, quote, only human. And God is regularly reminding you that, in fact, you're not only human, right? Or to use the Pauline language, he says we are called to be more than conquerors, right? You're not just a conqueror. You're actually called to be more than that, You're not just a human being. You're actually more than that, right? So she also kind of makes this connection around this notion of the political aspect of things, and why it is that sometimes people struggle with this notion of if I love myself and that brings me love to God, then we can kind of focus on ourselves and not really get involved with the political world, right? I do not know how many times I've heard folks say, Pastor, it's really important that preachers preach the gospel and nothing political, as though they're separate or whatever. And I understand the sentiment behind that. I've said it before, I'll say it again, that I think that the sentiment of, hey, we don't want to hear politics from the pulpit is actually not what you're saying. I think what you're saying is we don't want partisanship from the pulpits. We want politics. We're fine with that, but we don't need partisanship. So if I stand up on Sundays and say, here's all the reason why our current president is a genius and our previous president is a moron, that is partisanship, right? But if I'm able to be prophetic, like they're studying in Disciple, where the prophets were able to speak to all of the kings, good ones and bad ones, and say, hey, guess what? You're still screwing the pooch in all of these other ways, right? We seem okay with that. Still uncomfortable, but we're tolerable of the political, not the partisan, right? And finally, the wheel metaphor informs our relationships with God, others, self, but it also informs our image of God. And I won't go into this excursus here, this little kind of sidebar, but if you look in the email that I sent, that kind of living document, the Google document that has all of these notes, I put in there a whole little section called, on page 10, called Images of God. And Images of God then has these 4 kind of categories. And last week talked about the quadrigia, and there's kind of 4 historical, not exclusive, but historical, like these aren't the only ones, of interpreting the Bible or doing interpretation. You remember those? Yeah. Yeah, the literal, the moral, the allegorical, the anagogical, right? There's also kind of 4 traditional, again, not exhaustive, the kind of 4 traditional notions or images of God. God is a being, God is a hyper being, God is the ground of being, and God is the groundless ground of being. Again, I won't talk about any of that now. You can read that and explore it on your own terms. But this, the thing that you think God is, I promise you, is probably similar to other people in this church, but we're all probably in the same category, right? More than likely, most of us at Keller United Methodist Church probably think God is some version of a hyper being or the ground of being. And for whatever it's worth, at least one of your pastors holds that God is the groundless ground of being. And so there will be some times where I will not understand and you will not understand me because we're operating with different concepts, images of God. The wheel metaphor informs how we relate to one another and how we relate to God, how we relate to self. It also informs how we view God. So that's probably a theology conversation for another day. Images of God, and that probably could be a whole Underground Seminary all on its own. So if you're interested, you can look at that at your own convenience. I want to also highlight, she speaks a lot about this, again, back to this wheel notion and the interconnectivity of love of God, self, and neighbor, and how bound up those things are. Okay, so I have my wife has an uncle. His name is Gordon. That's his actual name. I've never met another Gordon in my whole life. So if you know a Gordon, it might be the same guy. Gordon, and he is a guy that up until recently, he's retired, he read brain scan, CT scan, like brain stuff. And he's very, very, very good at it. He, Scott and White down in the Temple area, he tried to retire multiple times, and they're like, can you please just not retire for these certain cases? Because they're tough nuts to crack. Eventually he did retire, and by retired, they said, okay, we have to pay you so that we can tell ourselves we're not going to pay you anymore, and he left. I asked Gordon, how did you learn, and I've mentioned this metaphor before, how did you learn to read brain scans? Has anybody heard me tell you this story before? Great. Some of you might have, maybe Dan has. How do you train to read brain scans for these really acute brain cancers? He says, well, when I say it out loud, it's pretty simple, but it gets complicated in its application. You start by, they showed us early on, a picture of a brain and a cancer the size of a baseball. And they're like, okay, where is the cancer? And anybody and their dog could point and say, well, that looks weird. Great. They'd show us a bunch of those. And you didn't notice it, but each time you went through this process, the baseball-sized cancer shrunk 0.5 millimeter. And we did this for weeks. They'd start off a certain size, and we just look at that. And then when we graduated to the next level, the cancer just got a little bit smaller, right? And it was all in different locations. But so over time, you trained your eye to be able to see the most minuscule of cancers because we were able to first see what it looks like in its extreme form, right? And notice the curvatures of the brain of what happens whenever there's a foreign thing. And you see the kind of the weird changes that are real obvious. But then it gets real, when it gets real small, those same patterns, they're just smaller. But we've been trained to do that. Does this make sense to anybody else? You can see how this, genius. Awesome. Okay. I don't know how many people have told me, I love nature because that's where I see God. Okay? And I think to myself, no kidding. I've never met a person who's not ever had an experience of the transcendent or the divine or the thing that they couldn't explain when they're on the top of a mountain or at the seashore or the depth of a valley or whatever. It's super obvious. Anybody and their dog could see God in nature. Sunsets, sunrises. You are not extra talented or gifted in your ability to experience or see God in nature. As potent as those things are, those are good, but they are ubiquitous. It's been said that God has two Bibles. The first Bible was creation, right? Now, good on you for seeing God in nature. I think that is wonderful. However, it's underdeveloped and immature because you cannot live on a mountaintop your whole life. If you are unable to see God in the crap or the mundane of life, your ability to train your eye to see as Jesus saw, to love as God loves, is deficient, right? And you're just looking at brain scans of baseball-sized tumors. That's all you're doing. And so the work or the effort or the kind of the development or the training that goes into spiritual disciplines is to put us into situations where each time we encounter this situation, time and different times, that the if you will, the thing that we're looking for gets smaller and harder to see, right? Because sometimes things are really, really dark. And it's really, really hard to see God. And in those darkest moments is actually when you want to see God the most. Right? I mean, at least I do. So there's a story from Elie Wiesel. Has anybody read The Night? It's a powerful story. Groups of people are moving through the concentration camps. Tells a story. And there's a line of people, and the story picks up here. Where is God? A voice shouted. Where is he? For more than half an hour, this child they saw hanging by a noose just stayed there, struggling between life and death, dying in slow agony under our eyes. And we had to look on him full in the face, this child. He was still alive when I passed in front of him. His tongue was still red. His eyes were not yet glazed. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "Where is God now?" I heard a voice within me answer him, "Where is God? Here he is. He's hanging here on this gallows." So you can read the whole, the rest of that, right? But my point in this is to highlight that when you need to see and experience the divine is when the days are the darkest and the hardest. And if all we've done is trained our eyes to be able to see God on the beautiful sunset and sunrises, we will be ill-equipped when we walk by the gallows of hell. And we will begin to fall into disrepair and disarray and say, woe is me, or I'm only human. There's nothing that can be done. And nihilism sets in, and are you with me? And we just spiral out. And so then we seek the dopamine that's in our little pockets, and we doom scroll or Instagram or play a video game. Mine is Plants vs. Zombies Heroes. And all the while, we are failing to train our eyes to see God in even the darkest of places. Do we genuinely believe, as we say on Sundays, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation, nor powers, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come? Are you with me? Like, if we genuinely believe that, then we've got to be able to put practices into place, like Gordon, training to see something more acutely, right? When the days are the darkest, when the person who has cancer but they can't figure out what's wrong, they have all these symptoms, those days are really, really dark. And oddly enough, Gordon's job, while to diagnose cancer and to locate it sounds terrible, for so many of the most difficult cases, it was good news because now there's a thing. They know what it is. They found something, right? Are you with me? So these practices, this work that you're embarking upon as a Christian, we are embarking on as a communion, is tedious and difficult because the goal is love, to see love in all of its iterations, in all of the places, even when other people might cry out, where is God in the midst of this? City on a hill, right? A light revealed by a bush, uncovered by a bushel basket, the leaven and the loaf, the salt of the earth, right? Can you see salt on the earth? Right? Are your eyes trained to see it? Are you with me? This is the work that they were trying to do, these desert folks. To see love even in these terrible, terrible, difficult, tragic situations. Is it possible? Is God anywhere there? And that takes training. Okay? Can you see God in this terrible moment? Whatever this terrible moment might be. And if not, that's all right. We're all here training together. We try to train every Sunday, right? We go to the gym once a week, as it were. Maybe we should go more often. I don't know. On page 27, we'll flip over. Does this make sense? Can you see? I'm not trying to belabor a point, but it's more. There's an urgency to this work. Let me say it. There's something at stake here. Whenever the world is very much full of dark and disarray and concern that it's all falling apart, and we all wonder, well, where is? There needs to be, if you will, to quote Isaiah, a voice from the wilderness crying out, prepare the way of the Lord. Yes? You and I, as advocates, empowered by the Holy Spirit, who are not just human beings, we are more than human beings, right? Divine, beautiful creatures of beloved of God, infused by the gospel to proclaim, right? And how can anybody know unless somebody tells them? You are asked, you are invited as a disciple to proclaim, to point out where God is in the midst of all of this. Are we prepared? Are we trained? Do we have the eyes to see what the world so desperately is asking for evidence of? Or will we join the crowd of untruth and say, well, where the hell is God? Where the hell is love in the midst of all of this? Right? Called to be different in this particular way, to be, if you will, in the world but not of it, right? Did you have something, Kara? Okay, yeah, okay. There is an urgency to this. There is something at stake in this work. It's not just an intellectual or idealization or navel-gazing, right? The hesychastic world, just looking at our tummies as we pray together. No, there is something really very much at stake here. The breaking the addiction to the false promises of a religion to proclaim something countercultural that we call the good news, that's rooted in this gospel, this life and death of a God that we call Jesus Christ, right? Who forsook the idea of a lackless lack to embrace, to become human, who emptied himself and became obedient, right? To the point of death. The baby born who was in need. Friends, this is good news. This can actually has the potency to break the chains of hell and death, to use some other archaic language. Yes? Okay. Page 27, sorry, we're skipping just a little bit more in these 10 minutes here. If you look on page 27, as a saint grew closer, the second paragraph there, I'm sorry, this is the section where she continues to talk about, whom do I love, right? And I know I skipped pieces here, but just as a remind you, this notion of humility. Furthermore, rather than a growing of love isolating us from the world and its problem, just the opposite is true. All the saint grew close, as the saint grew closer to God and to other people, the clearer it became that all people are alike in their sin. We all of us share a lack. There's a movement, and it's been brewing for a while now, and I've mentioned it in other settings. It's a movement that has Christian language around it, but I would argue is anti-Christian at its very nature. And that is the movement to, it was popularized most commonly with a guy named Rod Dreyer. He wrote a book called The Benedict Option. Has anybody heard of this? I haven't read the entire book, but from what I've read and understood and been engaged in conversations, Dreyer and others of this ilk promote the idea that the world is gone to hell in a handbasket, it's broken, it's corrupt, it's terrible, and what we Christians need to do is actually remove ourselves from the broken, grody dirtiness of all of that and start our own conclaves. So we need to start our own school structures, we need to start our own groups, remove ourselves from the public, which is gross and broken, right? So that we might retain enough kind of bunker down and wait for this time of evil to pass over, and then we can emerge like a fallout shelter to a new world and start again. So this is called the Benedict option, is what he calls it, which is a bastardizing of what St. Benedict actually attempted to do, but that's another critique. But this is really, really common these days, right? The world is terrible, and so there's a natural, I'm not saying like it's not rational. There's a rationalization to say, look, there's a terrible thing going on here. My instincts are to remove myself from that thing. I get it. And sometimes you've got to do that. Absolutely. If you are in a situation where your spouse is beating you, you need to get out of that. And we as communion can be a part of helping people get out of those terrible situations, right? For sure. There are places that we have got to be liberated from, for sure. However, this way, that we know that there are ways in which that is appropriate. This is bled out into this idea that, well, all of it's bad, right? All of it's bad, and we've got to remove ourselves from it. And so this idea of a removal from the world and kind of have our little hovels, right? And then flash it out there that it's Christian, right? That is not. That misses the point. That actually misses the whole thing, right? It's kind of like saying if someone, have you guys heard the phrase to dissect a bird? You know what that means? Birds have beautiful songs, right? And if you ever wanted to capture that song, right, and find out where is that song located in the bird, right? You capture the bird, you kill the bird, you dissect it, and as you dissect it, what happens to the song? Yeah, it goes away, right? It goes away. Now you're on pursuit to find the song, right? To do the noble thing, right? But it is completely misguided. Like you've gone way off kilter, right? So I would argue from the desert tradition that a complete and total removal from society because society is bad, right? And that we're going to retain some sort of purity over here, that's like dissecting a bird, right? You're killing the very thing. You're killing the very thing that you say you want to retain and uphold, right? It was mentioned earlier, just on the way down. Well, what about the desert folks that receded, like Abba Anthony? He moved way out there, all by himself, in isolation or an anchorite. There's these folks that live by themselves. Would offer up another way to understand what they were doing. Do we remember why they went to the desert to begin with? Were they escaping the evil of their society? No. They thought that they thought that they were going out to where the demons were to confront the demons. Right? This is what Jesus does when he is in the desert. You remember this? Yeah. So the Abbas and the Ammas were like, where is evil? Well, it's not here in our city, right? Because we're not just humans. We're beautiful, beloved children of God, right? It's got to be where Jesus found the demons. And where were the demons? Oh, in the desert. Let's go kick their ass out there, right? Like, They thought about what they were doing was actually this pursuit of on behalf of the whole, not removal from the whole, right? So, yep. So just be mindful that like these temptations to extract from for self-preservation may not always be, regardless of whatever leader might call it Christian, might not be Christian, right? Might not be Christian. If it genuinely, if the world is this terrible and has always been this terrible, then it's weird that God would choose to come to earth if God is whole and complete and perfect. Why would God get God's hands messy in the thick of all of this evil when God doesn't have to? God could remove God's self, wait for all this to blow over. Y'all just kind of eat yourselves alive. And then whenever the dust settles, then I'll come down and rebuild. Right? That's not what happens. That's not the Christian story. Right? So be mindful of the siren song of the extraction from engagement with the other as though evil is located in the other. Right? Evil's not always located in the other. Sometimes the temptation to remove from the other is because the demon has actually taken hold in the castle that is your heart, right? And convinced you that this is of God, right? To remove, to disengage. Again, we all know because we're mature and we're adults, there are definitely situations where you've got to remove self and others. Right? We know this. Okay. We're going to stop there. We'll make note on page 27, perhaps, is where we're at. This line here, perhaps it is true, right before the phrase, the love of God, perhaps it is true that the only great lovers of God and lovers of other people can look steadily on real human sin and not despair. Perhaps it is true that only the great lovers of God and other people can look steadily on real human sin and not despair. Friends, do not despair. We're going to pick up there next time because this is a nice echo to the life of Moses and Moses' encounter with God. And Moses, couldn't look at God in the face. But we'll pick up there as a precursor to next week. Next week is live, correct? I think. Yeah, we're not recorded next week, right? I don't think so. I know there's one that's recording soon, and the schedule's there. Just be mindful. It's one of the weeks. But any questions, comments, concerns, shenanigans, provocations? I want to thank you very much for your continued investment or engagement with this material. Again, agree, disagree, that's fine, but I'm trying to pursue understanding first. And so if there are ways in which that this isn't making sense, or it's not clear, or there's some lack of understanding, those are probably, again, that's the stage that we're at right now. Can you just understand this before we start calculating if this is a good or a bad, and perhaps maybe don't deploy something you don't know, right? Don't utilize something that you don't yet understand, right? So, amen.